Hi everyone, my name's Freya Sampson and I'm a regular columnist and journalist for Supernal Magazine Australia. And today it's my great privilege to be here with the very wonderful and fabulous Leon Bracelin, who is an archaeologist. He's a resident archaeologist at Ludlow Castle in Shropshire, England. And he also has a wonderful history and passion in the esoteric. Welcome, Leon.
Hi, Freya, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
It's great to have you here. We had a wonderful radio show with you just recently as well, so we're leading off some more from that. That was just a fabulous journey. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your whole gig, really.
I'm actually looking forward to actually talking to you about that and leading you on this journey that has been so far my life.
Please give our listeners out there a little bit of background on you and how it is that you came to be steeped in the esoteric and also move into your passion and career of archaeology.
Yeah, no worries. Well, yeah, I suppose I'm one of those unusual people. I really do love what I do. I work, as you said, as an archaeologist, so I'm pretty much a scientist. Um, and I also have a very deep association and interest into the esoteric. And I suppose what I mean by that is all of the unusual elements to life, like archaeology. When we're looking at the things that we find, it's really all to do with people. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to work in my career, but also within my passion of mythology, superstition, why we do things as people, as humans. And you know, it's a journey of discovery on both sense, actually. And you never know what you're going to find, but primarily it always asks the question, why we do things.
How is it that you came to be asking that question, why? Where did that start for you?
Well, it's a good question, and it goes right back to perhaps when I was about 5 years old, even earlier, really. I was brought up here in a quite an unusual household, really. My mother, my father. My father was an anthropologist, but he was very big into the whole Wiccan movement in the 50s, 60s. I suppose being brought up, I discovered a natural ability myself, and it always led me to ask the question, why are we here? Who are we? And, you know, what's this life about? You know, the big questions, not so much the small question. And it's never left us. And I think it's something that we, you know, as people, as the essence of spirit, if you like, which all religions and all beliefs and faiths encapsulate, I think there's a lot more to this life than perhaps what we perceive.
I would reflect and agree on that statement. Given that that's your perspective on things, and that's your upbringing. You know, that's been your upbringing. Was your dad's career in anthropology, was that any influence on how you came to archaeology?
Yeah, it was partly, definitely. I mean, in general terms, with anthropology, it's understood that the discipline looks at why we do things, what we believe in, our place. And I suppose with archaeology, it's about finding things out as opposed to finding things. But that's the discipline that I kind of was led to. And the first excavation that I was on was of an Iron Age, later used by a Roman temple down in the southeast. And it's funny where you are located, where you're, where you're led to, and a type of environment. There's always a message in that. But my dad, the two are very closely related, and I think that they're not that far removed. But that is what pushed me in that direction generally.
That must give you a deeper insight into the entire picture of the beingness of human, which is effectively what I'm hearing you say is the exploration that you're on. You mentioned about people and why we do things and how we do them and what we're doing. So can you share with us some of the things that you're exploring at the moment?
Yeah, I'm actually the work that I'm doing in this town in Ludlow is all really leading to try to understand the origins of the town, and there's lots of different processes that are leading me to do that. What I'm, in archaeological terms, looking at is the medieval pottery and the change in how we were using these things in everyday life, and a lot of that, you come up with some very interesting surprises, and Bellarmine jugs, which bottles that you sometimes come across that are basically bottles deposited upside down in entrance ways, and if you're lucky enough to find one, it's the whole process. They've actually got them in the Pitt Rivers Museum there, and the whole process was a form of protection. And what I found in archaeology with the finds, the processes, looking at different cultures way back in history, we've always we've always had this attribute to the here and after, the afterlife, and we did that really from the moment that we first buried someone in the ground, which we know goes right back to the Ice Age. If you look at Mesolithic archaeology, in the early prehistoric, we were doing it then, and it's not just in one location, it's worldwide, it's everywhere. And I think that there's a very close association with death and what's after this life, and it comes through not only in what we see out there, but it comes back in and reveals itself through the ancient past. There's lots of different threads that interconnect with us, and I use dowsing for example. So in this region, when I first moved here, I met a lot of the older generation that used to use hazel sticks and other natural things to divine where water is, for example, and that works. That's a fact. It works. It's used, and its origins go way back, and it's very far removed as, I suppose, being seen as a pseudoscience, when in fact it's not. And one of the main objectives with me is, I think, in science, if you can't see it, touch it, feel it, smell it, in a tangible sense, it doesn't exist. But it's moving away from that now, and if we start asking these other questions, and then perhaps look at how that's replicated in the past in consideration to today's terms, we as people are not that far removed. You may have lucky charms about you. You may have something of your possession that's important to you, that goes back for a family custom. Even from when we're children, from the tooth fairy. All of these things have a direct impact in who we are and how we live ourselves, how we live today.
You make a lot of really interesting points there, and one of the things I can certainly say here in Australia, where I am, one of the customs that had been brought across from England in the when the settlement of Australia occurred, we see on farms the practice of divining. So it's very well accepted, always has been, to get a diviner in to find the water. Also, you were speaking about death and how it is that human beings have a particular ritual around that, and that there is very clear evidence of that process. And it strikes me that it is interesting because, you know, it is the end of a life once we've actually attained a body, lived a life, and then are buried in preparation for the afterlife. That's a very tangible thing. But what's not perhaps so tangible, I'm wondering, is it in terms of birthing rituals? Is that something that you can find much out about through archaeology, and have you?
It's a really interesting question, because that I've only come across that, and I have seen other people with their expertise sort of look into that. When you go back to prehistory, it's all about the ritual landscape, and it's certainly, you know, it's very complicated. It's not straightforward, and I'm not a prehistorian. But all of it is to do with the treatment of the dead, the things that go on after, our perception of time, space, and where we are now. And I think that what you touch upon there are certain things that are hard to place on the archaeological record. So if I did a ritual, so for example, we do find this, and what you said about where you are in Australia is really interesting, because these 16th century witch markings that I've been finding, actually you've got them where you are. They're all over the place apparently. I've been looking at that. But back to the point, when you do if I did a ritual and I was burning something, you know, and I deposited it in the ground, or if I wore a particular charm, or then it's tangible. When I'm dead and I'm laid to rest, you can see it. You know, if you excavated the ground where I deposited it, you can see it. But if I did a ritual that was dancing, a bit like birth, how is it recorded? Because there's no record of it. So it's bloody interesting. There's a lot more, I think, work that could be done looking at these, you know, perhaps looking at conception, and that ties in very closely with sort of coming of age. The initiation practices that we do know that they were doing in the prehistoric time, but there's no tangible record for that. Nothing was written down then as well. Later on, you do see it. So we have this evolution of midwifery, the people that the hedge witches, real innate knowledge of medicine, and you know, the biological compound of our lives. So it's a good question. I don't know a lot about it, but I think it should be looked at in different ways
to create a whole picture. I think it's a fascinating
I mean,
exploration, and perhaps possible through the more esoteric work that you do.
I mean, the interesting thing, I mean, on that is, you know, say, for example, today, in the last few hundred years, probably the last 500 years, we've been christening children, let's say, newborn children. Priest will anoint the child's head with water. So in the future, how's that recorded? It will only be recorded if the font, is in situ or destroyed. If the site's been leveled, you can see the area where they were doing the christenings, which is always by the font. But you can't see the water, and you can't. So it asks a lot of interesting questions.
You mentioned witch markings, and I have a question forming around that. The term witch, what does that mean? Because I've heard of a number of different ways of describing people who had knowledge or gifts. Perhaps the cunning folk or the fae are terms
Yeah.
that I understand from English folklore. Is that the same kind of person, or do they fit into the same category?
Yeah, no, it's a pretty good question. There's one, witch. But witch, where does that come from? What does it mean? And this is what we ask in archaeology. This is also what we're trying to determine. If you look, in some respects, you could say it's a derogatory term for somebody that has an innate knowledge of nature, that's used the old ways. You refer to the cunning folk. Yeah, there's a record of those people later on, I think even from the 14th, 15th century, 16th century, that were the fixers. You know, if you felt as if you had a curse put on you, you would go to the local cunning folk and they would remove it. But the term, that we have to be careful with terms. In fact, somebody said to me, where is the origin of witchcraft? And I would say, to be honest, it's way back in prehistory, because to me, all it means, all that represents, is somebody who works with nature, that has an innate knowledge of how these things work, and could be seen as a wise person. Fast forward in history, and you know, my dad and some of the people he was knocking about with sort of pushed the emphasis in the 50s and the 60s of Wicca, and it was based on that. And the word itself really relates to old wise one. But if you look at the origins of Wicca, you know, and the format and the systems that are there, it's all take the ancient past. Yeah, I know when Gerald Gardner wrote his Book of Shadows, there was this big contention about where did he get his source and his origin. Well, actually, if you really look at the honesty of it, it's come from very ancient practices molded together. Nothing wrong in that, and that's fine. But you know, that whole emphasis on the label, you know, the term witch in Europe and Australia is very different to what the term means in Africa, say, for example. And that's where you get a blend of these religions coming in, mostly seen really in South America. Go to Cuba, and a lot of their, you know, ritual voodoo practices are now heavily incorporated in Catholicism, almost masks it. So you have to be very careful. That's what's happened. But you know, it's exciting times, and I think we're pushing things forward on how we do things. But the label, the term, that's all it is. It's a term. And to do it is to understand.
So to be able to behave like a witch, one must have done the work, the practices,
yeah,
and lived it. The term, though, just to clarify, is a unisex term?
I think so. Yeah. I think today that's how it's seen. It might not have always necessarily been so in the past. It's not always necessarily so. I think it was perhaps something born out of fear, even if it was done in a derogatory way. But I think that the origins in, I suppose, what we're talking about in a craft or a natural sense, I've always, I can't prove it, but I always believe it comes really from a feminine source, which is all to do with life, death, rebirth, you know, and our genders have obviously a role to play in that. But the female principle, I suppose you could say, is really where the origins come from. If you look at the origins of the church, actually, in this country, it was, you know, before it was a religion, it was a movement. And we know that, you know, in the Anglo-Saxon period, which is that period between the 5th and the sort of 8th century, used to be known as the Dark Ages, which we've moved away from. It was the women that was being buried in high status burials. There was this respect You go to the early churches here, a lot of them should be really pagan. Well, they are on older pagan sites. And you see sheen and the gigs, you know, the booby effigies with the, you know, in the middle. And there you go. You know, women is a universal birth, death, conception. You know, all throughout the world is the same word that's used for the same thing. So, yeah, for me, I think it's got a feminine sort of really, you know, underneath.
Leon, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I could just talk with you for hours and hours and hours, and I'm sure all of our listeners and viewers out there will be loving to hear from you again, and I know I would. Thank you so much for an amazing chat, and here's to many more. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bless you.
And you.